So, first of all, let me introduce myself. Some of you I've not met. I'm Ed Green, and I've been executive director of EARCOS for a little over a year now. And it's been quite an interesting year, I must say, for all of us. And people said to me, yeah, you had a great start. You had, let's say, 2 typhoons, a volcano, and now the pandemic. So it has not been boring. And I know none of you have had what you would call a boring year. And before we begin, I just want to tell all of you who are counselors how much we appreciate what you're doing. We know your job has become increasingly difficult and challenging, and you're a savior to the communities and the kids that you're working with. And we were talking this summer about what might we be able to do to lend some support, because as an organization of 190 schools, it's kind of hard to do almost anything and make a difference. But we came up with something I think that you will really like. And I'm just so delighted to be able to introduce Sean Truman to you, who has himself been an overseas kid and has a great interest in the international schools world. And really, that's all I have to say. If you have questions, please go ahead and add them to the chat section. And then when Sean is ready to address some of the questions, I'll read them to him, and we'll go from there. But thank you for making time on your Saturday morning to join us. And yeah, I'm looking forward to this evening very much, or this morning. Okay, Sean, over to you.
Thanks, Ed. Thank you all so much for coming. As Ed just said, on a Saturday morning, it's serious dedication when you're willing to get out of bed, have 1 cup of coffee, and then get on one more Zoom call after all the Zoom that we've done. So I have a request. What I was hoping that we could get. There's a number of people who've got video on, but I was hoping that if you are if you're able to, if you wouldn't mind switching on video, it would be helpful. One of the worst things in the world to do as a speaker is to try to speak into the void. I would much rather be somewhere where after this we could all get some really good street food and sweat in the street and just talk to each other and have this be normal. Thank you for people who are doing this on. So again, if you're reasonable, one of my favorite moments of this last 2 or 3 months as we've done more and more Zoom is there. I was giving a fairly large talk, and there was a guy who I'm still not sure, I'm hoping he wasn't aware that his video was on. He was reading the newspaper and his cat walked through his cereal. And then when he realized that, he whipped around, the cat spilled the cereal on him, and he stood up and he was wearing no pants. So if you could turn your video on and you're wearing pants, that would be great. If you're not wearing pants, if you could just sort of do the anchor man or anchor woman thing and ensure that you're shooting from the sort of chest up, that would be fantastic. So let me just talk a little bit about just some of the technical stuff. So we're trying to avoid death by Zoom here for you this evening, or this morning for you. What I'd like to do is make this hopefully as conversational as possible. It's obviously really challenging. We've got 40-something people, and it's difficult for us to crosstalk. As Ed just said, we're going to have the chat available. He'll monitor that, and as we're going along, if you have questions, or if there's things that sort of precipitate thinking, just write something there, and then Ed will kind of screen it. And if it seems pertinent, and Ed, you could just feel really comfortable to just jump right in and say, hey, we've got a question, or somebody has a comment. The other thing is, I got a whole bunch of slides here. One of the things I really don't like a lot about Zoom is it's not easy for me to simultaneously see you and have you see slides and have me see slides as I go. So what I might do here a little bit is toggle back and forth. I've done this multiple ways. I've done it without slides, which always seems like, I feel like a wildebeest wandering on the Serengeti by the end of that. But at the same time, if we just stay with the slides, then I'm just talking to a disembodied bunch of slides, which doesn't work real well for me. So we'll try it, we'll see how it goes, and if it's a flail, we'll figure something out. So let me just start by sort of describing who I am and what we do and why I'm here. So I'll just sort of share this screen with you here. Here we go. Okay, so let me just talk a little bit about myself. So as Ed said, I'm sitting right now in St. Paul, Minnesota, where I have been grounded since March the 11th. I remember exactly, actually. The last time I was out of the country, I flew back from Addis Ababa, where I had been for a week, and then COVID hit, and everybody's been locked down since then. But now, as Ed said, I grew up in Kenya. My mom was a school teacher in Nairobi. She actually was a third grade teacher at the International School of Kenya. I moved back to the States, finished high school, went to college, went to graduate school, and married a girl from St. Paul, Minnesota. Not all in that order, but it turns out if you marry a girl from St. Paul, Minnesota, you end up in St. Paul, Minnesota. So not that it's not a good place, but that's just sort of why people frequently say, look, why is a guy who's doing international mental health associated with, the center of the country here on the northern border? And that's sort of how it all came to pass. In my career, I've always been interested in making sure that people in our community, I view the international community as my community still, I've always been committed to wanting to ensure that people have access to mental health. And in 2010, we started the Truman Group. The Truman Group started out a merry band of clinicians, a small group of people who started taking care of folks internationally. And we have over the last 10 years or so grown to, I think we're at 53 clinicians now. The reason that we've grown in this way is because, as you all know, in many of the places where you're working, there are few or no local providers for mental health, frequently of any type, whether it's culturally similar, linguistically similar to the people that you're taking care of. And this is what we've been trying to sort of address in our practice and trying to support people. So I just like this slide because this is where we've worked. And actually, if you can see my cursor here, for those of you who are reasonably good with African geography, it's Libya, Chad, Niger. So actually, we've taken care of people in a couple of these places too. So this is actually filled in a little bit. But we've taken care of a lot of people around the world, and we continue to. So let me just talk a little bit about what I'd like to try to do today. We're obviously in the midst of just this extraordinary time, and I think what I'd like to do is try to avoid a talk that I've been asked to give multiple times, which is basically a version of COVID, so talk about it. It reminds me of my son when he was a little guy, when he was 4, in the back seat. He would say that to me, he'd say, "Dad, dinosaurs, so talk about it." And I would have to just riff on everything I could think of. And as he got smarter and more sophisticated about dinosaurs, I had to deepen my knowledge about it. You couldn't just go for the basic T-Rex thing. But I think what we've got to do to understand where we are and to understand the reasons and the ways that we're actually being so taxed by what's going on as people who are caring for members of these communities is we've got to be a little bit more granular, a little bit more analytical about what exactly people are struggling with, not just it's sort of, one version of this is we've got this tsunami of difficulty, and all of us are dealing with that. I think that in order for us to be effective, it can be helpful to really try to kind of be a little bit more analytical about what's going on, why we're seeing these things, and ways that we can be effective as we think about kind of going forward in the context of school communities. And then last but not least, I want to talk about how do we not burn up on this? How do we survive? How do we provide care? How do we be compassionate? How do we look after all these people that we're supposed to look after? And at the end of the day, still be human beings and not just completely lose our capacity to manage ourselves. So it's sort of a 3-stepper. And we now have only about 45 minutes. So we're going to save the world and do it really fast here. We're going to be talking fast. All right. So, I think it starts out, it's like, look, it seemed like things were already difficult. Is it me? Things were already hard. And then COVID hit. And, I've gone around the world talking about mental health vulnerability, and I'm going to talk in a more specific way about that. And I guess what I want to start by saying is, it isn't you. I think one of the benefits, if we can call it a benefit, of COVID right now for people who are doing counseling is everybody is exquisitely aware that we are dealing with an extraordinary circumstance right now. We are working in conditions, all of us, across communities that none of us have managed before, and it's clearly completely outside of what the normal range is. But this was contextualized by things that were happening before COVID. And I just want to talk about that. So I want to talk about, if we can just wind back a little bit before we had the epidemic, the pandemic, and if we can just talk about adult mental health vulnerability before COVID came. So the paper that I'm citing here, it's a paper I wrote actually with a couple of colleagues. And the reason I've got it up here is because one of the things that people in mental health have, and people who've been working internationally have talked about for a long time, is they've sort of wrestled back and forth with, are people who are living expatriate lives and living internationally, are they at greater risk for mental health difficulties than people who are just living at home? And we heard a lot of anecdotal reports about this, and people would write stuff. And they say, well, I've been working for many years overseas, and my experience I've had, but those kinds of clinical reports or anecdotal reports aren't necessarily the best way to evaluate whether people are actually at greater risk when you evaluate sort of, in a methodical way. So one of the things we were able to do in this paper is we were able for the first time to really compare people who are living internationally with people who are living domestically. The domestic people were in the United States. And what we found is that there were differences, and the differences were of the types that many of us would expect, that people who were living internationally had higher rates of mental health risk. They had more problems with internalizing problems. Those are problems like depression and anxiety. Externalizing problems, people who were acting out in ways that weren't really great for them. There was more substance abuse in the expatriate population, which of course is not coming as a surprise probably to anybody sitting on this screen right now. And the other thing that happened is that when you compare people's family adjustment, there were differences in those ratings too. The reason that's really important is because it means that just sort of baseline, the expatriate population has been at risk, a thing that we've got to be aware of. Again, all right, so that's the grown-ups. Well, what about the kids? Yeah, as I said, for the last few years, I've been flying around the world, and I've been talking about the fact that we've got this vulnerability in children. All of you, I don't have you all on my screen. I've got some of you on my screen. Is your experience been that, or your sense been that there's something going on with kids now that wasn't the way it was 10 years ago, some of us a little bit older, 15, 20, even 25 years ago? Is your sense that it's gotten to be more substantial as we've gone along? Can you either nod or shake your head? Or if you just want to look dazed at the screen, that's okay too. It's early for you probably, and that's okay. I see a lot of people sort of saying, yeah, it seems like there's been more going on in terms of kids' vulnerability. Every generation of adults going back as far as we have in recorded time has said, kids, what's the matter with kids? And so, what I'm going to very quickly do is I'm going to make the case that this is not what has been the usual thing over generations, that we are seeing vulnerability in kids in a different way than we've ever seen before. These are US-centric data, and for that I apologize. The reason I'm using these data is because it's very difficult to get good international mental health data that are sort of applicable to the communities of kids that we take care of. They're limited because of that in terms of the generalizability, but I think we should be aware of it, and I think it actually does speak particularly to kids in the international community. If you look, so the CDC has been famous lately because it's been so in the news for very distressing reasons in the United States. It's the Center for Disease Control. It's the sort of a conglomeration of health data in the US. And before the last 6 or 8 months, it was considered to be a reputable organization, and it's come under some serious fire. But in 2019, they did an evaluation. They basically looked between 2017 and 2007 and 2017, and they looked at the cohort of 10 to 24-year-olds. And there's been massive changes in mental health risk, suicidality, and admissions for dangerousness to kids themselves. If you look down, the Blue Cross data are referring to insurance data in the US, where we've seen medical claims for mental health stuff has gone up by 63% over the course of 3 or 4 years. And then pediatrics, which is one of the sort of flagship pediatric journals in medicine, we've seen really significant increases for hospitalization, suicide attempts, and suicidal ideation, where we've seen an almost doubling for the rates that we're seeing in kids. And those in this study, the greatest increases were in 15 to 17-year-olds. So we don't see changes like that epidemiologically. That's not the usual thing. Something is going on. And again, this is pre-COVID. One thing I always worry about is, well, as a psychologist, am I just sort of skewed and am I just looking for the data that's about, the pointy-headed people writing academic papers? So another way of thinking about this is, how much utilization is there in college campuses? And what I've got on this slide, and I'll just be very quick because already the time is fleeting. Penn is a large elite institution here in the United States, and they've got on the order of 58 or 59 clinicians for 24,000 students. Swarthmore, which is a small liberal arts college, very selective here, has 11 clinicians for 1,600 students. That's an astonishing ratio for mental health utilization. It's a school actually that my son graduated from, and when he was there, just because I wanted to know, I said to him, would you call up and find out how long it takes to get in? And he called and he said there was a 3-week wait to get into student mental health. And these are people, if you think about it, point prevalence, right? These are people who are able to carry probably 15 or 20 people on a caseload. I mean, it means that they've got on the order of 20% of their student body in outpatient psychotherapy chronically in their student mental health. USC in the 2019-2020 year increased the amount of mental health available to kids by 50%. I mean, these are, in terms of utilization, we've never seen anything like this before. So the reason I say this to you as counselors is because I frequently, when I go and I travel, when I'm not talking this way on Zoom, people literally come up to me and they say, Sean, what is going on? Is this me? Is it my school? Is there something about, Ouagadougou that is like completely out there? Or is it that there's something really going on? And what I'm trying to say is, I think there's something going on here. I want to talk about COVID. So again, the CDC did a series of evaluations, one of them in 2018, one of them recently in June of 2020. It's a national sample, and they conducted the assessment between June 24th and June 30th of this year. It was referring to it's a self-report measure, and they're having people talk about their experience of the previous 30 days. Participants are 18 years old, and there's 5,400 of them. So we're not talking about a small number of people. They didn't just go on the street and check it out. They did a big sort of careful stratification for getting samples right and representing different groups of people. And basically what they found, the overall findings were 40% reported an adverse mental health condition. 30% had significant symptoms of anxiety and depression, nearly a third. This is point prevalence now. This is general population. A quarter, more than a quarter, have trauma and stressor-related disorders. That's to say they're disrupted as a function of stressors associated with their living situations. 13%, more than 1 in 10, reported either significantly increasing or starting to use substances in response to COVID. And in the previous 30 days, 10% had been experiencing suicidal ideation. They were thinking about killing themselves. Again, these are not rates that we have ever seen before. This is unlike anything we've experienced. In Ed's really lovely introduction, he talked about the fact that this is not what any of us have signed up for. We didn't know what we were getting into. And the reality here is we've not seen this before as people taking care of folks in these communities. One of the things I think that's really striking here is you can, again, evaluate the time difference between 2019 and 2020 in problems with anxiety disorders, depression, substance use, suicidal ideation. In all of those categories, with the exception of substance abuse, we've seen multiples, somewhere between 2 and almost 5 times the rates that we've seen before, 4.5 times. So clearly, the last year has just been extraordinary for people. And what's really important in this, I hope I'm not boring you with data, but I want to base this on, I want you to be aware of what's happening, because these are the things that are primarily going on with regard to anxiety, depression. And the reality is that that's what we're seeing mostly. We're seeing problems with anxiety, we're seeing problems with depression, and we're seeing the problems most pronounced in younger people, which on some level doesn't exactly make sense, because people are much less likely to die or be really, really sick with COVID if they're younger. But the psychological experience of being in this pandemic is significantly more disruptive. In the, anecdotally and in the Truman Group practice, we're encountering a lot more mental health stuff with kids than we've seen even 10 and 15 years ago. And those two areas that we're seeing it in, again, this was true pre-COVID, is anxiety and depression. Here's what's weird. What's generally true is that high achieving families, higher levels of socioeconomic status, intelligence, more resources, that usually is protective. And the kinds of kids that we are involved in supporting in schools, in your schools, usually do better in those than kids without those resources. But those protective factors don't seem to be doing what they used to do. All right, so where does this land us? And where does this land schools? And the answer is it lands them with you. It's you. You people are superheroes, in my view. You are responsible for supporting not just students, but you're responsible for supporting all of the people in those communities in areas where there is no mental health resources available. And you know who you are and you know where you are. There aren't resources in many, many of the places where you guys are all working. And the work that you're doing is extraordinary because you're doing it in such difficult circumstances with so few supports. And that's really important, I think. Here's the problem. There aren't enough counselors. And the downside here, and this is maybe a little dark, there will never be enough counselors because there aren't enough counselors on the planet right now to adequately meet the demand from the kids who are in these schools or the parents who are raising these children. We are seeing changes in vulnerability and mental health that are not like what has come before us. And that was before COVID. The reason I'm saying all this is you've got to be strategic about your time and you got to be strategic about the ways that you're employing your resources in order to do as much as you humanly possibly can with very little to work with. All right, so this is that I'm hoping, I wanted to make sure that I got through the doom and gloom in the first 30 minutes. I think I just barely squeaked under it. Do you believe, again, I'm going to look for nods. Do you believe me that before COVID, we had some serious mental health risk? And look, anybody who's living, breathing right now, if you don't think there's mental health risk right now, you're seriously not paying attention. And if you really want to get stressed out and worry about mental health, just come back to the States right now. And I tell you what, you can be here. All right, so where does schools come in? I mean, if you think about it, schools are uniquely situated to help children develop all kinds of components to managing themselves emotionally that are absolutely intrinsically connected to their capacity to modulate how they do emotionally and relationally. I'll put that into English. You can teach them stuff at school. You can have them have experiences at school that help them get stronger, that help them learn how to tolerate more distress. It's called distress tolerance. Have any of you heard that term before? Again, give me a nod. I mean, you don't have to talk, but yeah, okay, good. Distress tolerance, again, is the idea that you can be distressed, you can feel terrible, and you cannot panic about it. All right? It means that you've been trained to recognize that things sometimes don't feel good, sometimes even really bad, but that in fact you're able to endure. And that is trained. That's not something that's just innate. Your ability to emotionally regulate, again, has got everything to do with the ways in which you learn how to manage your own emotional state. It means that you learn how to identify what's going on. You learn how to provide language to describe the way that you feel. And in social and emotional learning curricula all over the world, we're teaching kids this stuff, right? I mean, with the little ones, do we have anybody working with little ones, right? I mean, you know, we do all kinds of things. Like we're teaching them to talk about how they feel. We're teaching them to express their emotion that they're identifying in themselves, and then to deal with, how do you deal with being angry? And that goes all the way up the developmental continuum. Similarly, with failure recovery, if you are in a school and you teach students that failure is a catastrophe, well, then failure is a catastrophe. And there are many, many parents in the school communities that we're serving that think that's true. It's not true. However, if you teach kids that it's true, they're much, much more vulnerable to failure. And by that, I don't mean they fail more often. I mean, if they do fail, and we all do, the experience that they have emotionally is far more disruptive. It means that they don't have the ability to tolerate the experience very well. And as a consequence, they get way more disrupted. And that's really, really bad for kids. Because the reality is, I don't know what your lives are like, but I fail all the time. And most of us do. I see some people smiling thinking, how bad could the failures be? Terrible. We fail all the time, right? So how do you deal with that adversity? The reality is you have to get back up and you have to keep going. Where's a really powerful way to teach about that? Schools. Because that's an opportunity for kids to be engaged in all kinds of really challenging stuff. Social sensitivity and reciprocity. What is that? Well, it's the idea that you teach children to recognize the emotional experience and the social experience of other people. And then in the context of that, you then recognize that they're people and that the people in their classrooms are there, and then it's about a reciprocal relationship, and that goes. Getting social support and help when you need it. Like if you've been in, I spent a lot of time when I was a fellow at a child study center. I did a lot of work in early childhood stuff and parenting. And one of the things that we spent a lot of time thinking about was teaching very young children to ask for help when they need it. Why? Well, because if you come from really impoverished circumstances, they don't learn to ask for help because they don't expect to get it. So it's a really important way for people to develop this. Developing intimacy, self-soothing, stimulation. I want to make a really basic point here, and I'm sure, my guess is that I'm preaching to the choir, but well, let's see, I've got some of your faces on my sidebar here. Here's the point I'd like to make. That emotional disruption trumps intellectual engagement every time. Does anybody want to debate me about that? If you want to debate me, unmute yourself and let's argue right now. I'm willing to spend the time. The reason I'm saying this is because if you have a kid that's emotionally disrupted, their capacity to engage in effective learning at school is disrupted. And the reason I'm saying that is that I've been involved in a lot of work in communities where we've got high pressure parents who are really focused right now on ensuring that kids don't get behind. Everybody is terrified that the kids are going to get behind. The problem with that, and then the idea is, oh, well, the way we're going to remediate that is we're going to stay in front of these screens like for 10 hours at a time. We're going to just power through this stuff, and the kids are going to get this, and then the schools come under very, very significant pressure around it. And you need to advocate for another perspective, in my view, which is we need to manage parents' expectations. We need kids to be socially connected to each other in the schools and socially connected to their teachers. We need them to not just be flooded with math and science and social studies and English work. We want to manage parent expectations about this because the reality is everybody's going to be behind academically as a function of this experience everyone's having. Every educator that I've talked to that's serious about this, they say, look, there's no way that we can seriously stay where we would normally. It's just not possible. Similarly, you've got to be a presence, in my view, to advocate for school in the sense that you should say to teachers, don't overdo what you shouldn't sort of extend too far and demand to the point where kids are going to decompensate. Why? Because once you got a decompensated kid, they don't learn well. If you don't believe this, I'll tell you a very quick story. I lived in New Haven, Connecticut when I was a fellow. And one night as I was putting my then 2-year-old son to bed, I heard terrible screaming from the next door. It was during the crack epidemic of the sort of 1990s. I ran downstairs and my next door neighbor, I didn't realize it at the time, but she was getting mugged. I jumped over this wall. There was this kid there. I didn't realize it. This kid, he was there. He had a gun. Next thing I know, we were chasing him and then he shot at me. And I dove under a car and he sped away and that was it. He was a terrible shot, which is really good for me. And he missed it. And then I called up the police. The police said, hey, has anybody shot? We said, no. They said, okay, we'll be there in, I don't know, 3 or 4 hours because it was New Haven and they weren't too responsive to that stuff. They showed up and they said, okay, well, what was the race or the ethnicity of the person? And I said, I don't know. And they said, well, were they wearing were they wearing blue sweatshirt or gray sweatshirt? I said, I don't know. And they said, well, was it a tall guy or a short guy? And I said, I don't know. And the reason that I didn't know was I was very preoccupied with some other stuff. I was able to tell them that he shot at me with a small caliber semi-automatic pistol. And I remember seeing the empty cartridge spinning through the air. And I remembered that extraordinarily clearly. And everything else I don't remember at all. The reason of that, I'm saying that is because when you're highly charged emotionally, if you're really, really disrupted, your ability to be effective as a learner and to take in information in your environment is virtually zero. And some of the kids that are experiencing high levels of anxiety and depression right now, really, really struggling. Remember some of those early slides. We're talking about levels of distress that aren't about usual distress. These aren't worried kids. These are anxious kids, and it's at levels that are clinical. Clinical levels of anxiety interfere with people's ability to learn effectively. So what do we do? I mean, one of the things I think you just got to sort of be thoughtful about, and I think it's really important, is interaction is better than passive learning in this circumstance. And in particular, being social with people is important. These are not kids working from home, and you are not working from home if you're working remotely, and neither are your colleagues. What we're trying to do is we're trying to get through this really difficult period together. And emotionally and relationally and professionally, what we're doing right now is we're trying to hold on. That's what we're doing. We're trying to get to a point where we cross over to where we're able to return to schools and life is to return to more normal. And that's really, I think, what we're able to do. Social support is absolutely essential as we think about this. I would urge you to urge your colleagues to think about, and kids too, to have different regions in their houses or apartments where they work or not work, and it doesn't have to have lots of space. It just needs to be more about sort of them kind of psychologically segmenting off places where they do schoolwork or where your colleagues do work, and that you have an opportunity to disengage, because one of the problems that people are having right now that's contributing to this sense of helplessness and hopelessness is that there's this quality of inescapability for so much of what's going on. And if you can facilitate people doing more to segregate that and separate it, it's really helpful. Okay, so that's the problem. I was supposed to be the first third, but we're already at 40 minutes, so I'm going to have to talk a little bit faster. Ed, do we have any questions at all at this point that are coming up in the chat?
No.
All right, either it's that good or it's that bad. So if you have questions, just lay them out there, and I'll just keep spooling along here. So here's the thing. I think that one of the really important things to do as school counselors, when you think about how is it that you can work effectively, because it's overwhelming. I mean, the thing that I'm trying to say here is the reason that you're feeling like it's so big is because it's so big. You're not by yourself. I don't know if you can see every person on the screen right now, but like, just take a look. Seriously, like, look at all these people. Wave to each other. That person that you're waving at, yeah, they're doing the same thing you are. They've been laboring thinking that they're all by themselves and that they're there in their office and they close the door. You know, when you first go in the morning and it's still cool and quiet, and you're thinking to yourself, okay, how's this going to go, right? How am I going to get through this one today? What I suggest to you is you think about your work again strategically, and you think about it on multiple levels. I mean, the first and the most obvious, of course, is, look, you're working with individuals. And there's some basic things that I think we can do for kids in the context of a lot of downward pressure on them. The first is normalize distress. These kids are experiencing very, very high levels of distress because it's normal to experience that. We don't want to tell them that chronically that this is so weird and you're feeling so weird and it's all so crazy and it's so weird. It's like, well, because they take cues from us. It's like, no, you feel really bad because it's really difficult right now. Is it going to be okay? Yes. It is going to be okay. How do I know? Well, what about the Spanish flu of 1918 and 1919? I mean, I spend a lot of time in Africa. This isn't Ebola. This is bad, but it isn't Ebola. The reality is that there is going to be vaccine, and your kids live in a socioeconomic sort of stretch that it means they'll probably get fairly rapid access to it. This is a problem, and it's a time-limited problem, and it sucks. but it's time limited and it's gonna be okay. If you look at the news and you doom scroll, and a lot of these kids do, it's my favorite new word. I learned it this week, and evidently it's been around for a while. So you guys know about doom scrolling? Doom scrolling is where you scroll through the internet and you just sort of look for the things that are about the terrible stuff that's happening. And let's face it, right now, we've got like all kinds of lunacy. I'm going to censor myself slightly on multiple levels. Right now in the US, the entire west coast of the United States is on fire. In Eastern Africa, not only was there COVID, but there were locusts, right? Politically, I don't know if you people have heard, there's some stuff going on. So, I mean, it doesn't take a lot to recognize that, but the other reality is all of these things are things that are manageable, and that we have to argue, or we have to orient ourselves in our work with kids to let them know that that's okay, because they use us as social reference. We want them to differentiate what hurts from what's harming them. If you're gonna write down anything I say today, would you write down two things? One, normalize distress. It's okay to feel bad. There's a difference between feeling bad and things decompensating, and that's what I mean by differentiating between hurt and harm. Hurt means like if you pinch yourself hard and it's like, ow, that hurts, okay? Slamming your hand in a car door and breaking the bones in your hand, that's harm, because you lose function and you're injured. The same thing is true emotionally. Lots of things make people upset, but the reality is that the difference between that and people who are functionally impaired is very, very big. I'd like you to just some very concrete things. Sleep is being disrupted right now in children and adults in ways that we have never seen. There's lots of reasons for that. One of them has been that the schedules for people have been completely disrupted. And one of the other things is that the way that we're relying on technology, it's interfering with our normal rhythms. We've talked about this for years before we got to this point. It's way worse now. The single best thing that you can do when you're trying to get people to regulate themselves better with regard to technology is ask that kids don't sleep with it. Every time I'm with parents and they're always like, the children are using screens all the time, I always ask the really basic question. Hey, how many of you people sleep next to your phone? I'm looking for guilty faces, and I'm finding them, right? And then everybody says, it's my alarm clock, to which I'd say, you know, there are these technologies that actually date back really quite a long way, you know, like say 400 years. It's called a clock, and you can, you know, wind it in, plug it in. It does all kinds of amazing things, and it actually works really well to keep time. It's really important that people move. It's really important that people get outside if it's possible for them to do it. It sounds so simple, but I tell you, if you can get people to engage in this stuff, it significantly ameliorates anxiety and stabilizes depression. There is no more immediate and powerful intervention that you can use. If you think about groups, okay, so that's the way you're working with kids. And again, you know, you got to think about, you got a lot of kids. So you want to try to be as efficient and as effective as you can be in as broad a context as you humanly possibly can. So when you think about this, if you're working with groups in this period, think about skills development and think about, for example, big ideas like, for example, sleep without screens. See if you can set up a competition between your fourth graders and your fifth graders to see who can sleep without their telephones more effectively. Why? Well, there's huge secondary gain. You got to educate and set expectations for parents. Again, that's sort of group level thinking. So it's not working at the unit of an individual kid. Think about ways that you can scale what you do and how you do it to increase your ability to have effectiveness in a larger group of people. Because again, you guys are terribly outnumbered and under-resourced. So we've got to be sensible and we've got to be strategic about how we do this. And then think about peer groups, stress management groups, other kinds of things that you can do remotely that can be really helpful. I'm sure that many of you are in remote teaching situations right now that are pure. Some of you might be in hybrids. Some of you are going back. Lots of teachers have lots of angst about going back. There's all kinds, and that of course is gonna show up right at your doorstep, right? Because people are gonna be like, no, she's just for the kids. So we don't go talk to her about our problems because those are grown-up problems, right? That never happens to you all. Here's another thing that I think you might want to consider respectfully. So it's thinking about, and just so you know, I'm going to be talking to heads. Ed has very kindly invited me to speak to heads of many of your schools. And just so you know, I'm going to tell them a lot of this same stuff. Not just because I'm lazy, which is maybe a little true, but what's really true is that they need to hear this directly from somebody who is an outsider, who isn't just saying, hey, we need more resources, hey, we need, this is what we need. You need to democratize, in my view, the responsibility of supporting students in their mental health. And I always pick on the chemistry teacher or the physics teacher. And I always call him Bob. Bob, the physics teacher. It's like, Bob is always like, yeah, I didn't sign up to like talk about feelings. You know, I'm a physics teacher, Sean. I'm like, Bob, this is your big day, brother. This is it. You know, we're going to give you some idea. You want to give him permission. You want to tell him, hey, Bob, it's okay to talk about this stuff. If a kid's brokenhearted because, you know, her boyfriend just broke up with her, or he's struggling because he's not, you know, not able to play soccer or whatever the thing is that he's like, it's okay for Bob, the physics teacher, to be, I mean, it's tough. He's got to pat him on the back when he finally gets in the same room with him. It's going to make him a little uncomfortable, but it's okay, Bob. It's a skill you can learn. You got to help them with language. You got to teach them things, and you got to teach them how to ask about things. Here's a really tough one. Hey, how are you? How are you feeling? Hear how that get quiet? It's just a moment. And then a kid can think, and that's okay, right? Because it turns out that if you really ask kids stuff, a lot of them will tell you, not every time, not every kid. But if you've got more people in the community where you're explicitly saying, look, they can't just send every distressed kid to the big feelings expert. You guys are the big feelings experts, right? How are you going to deal with the volume? I see you looking at each other, some of you. I see everybody sort of like, oh, yeah, that's a good point, right? And you need to practice. You can teach them these things. I know this sounds a little ridiculous and audacious. What choice do we have? We have got to democratize some of this, because unless somebody's going to start flying in more people to help you with this stuff, we got to deal with, you know, these issues with the resources that we have available to us. I'm going to just blast through this here.
Sean.
Yeah.
A quick comment. We've had a really interesting additional point, I think, that I hope we can get to and try to summarize. Basically, we've been talking about counselors working with kids and all of that needs to take place. Here's a counseling team in one school. They're trying to facilitate staff reconnection. So much effort is being put into helping student transition, but not as much into the staff's transition and staff's welfare at the moment, because everyone's just trying to hold on. Some are getting back in, some are still, you know, back in the US. And this too is falling to the counselors, officially or unofficially.
Yeah, it's an absolutely brilliant point. And it's actually something that I've been contacted about this week 3 different times from 3 different schools on 3 continents. The issue is that school counselors are struggling. And one of the things that's really very powerful in a lot of schools right now is the disparity. First of all, the difficulty people are having with integration because they're fearful and because they're, you know, we've got some of the faculty who are older. We've got people with pre-existing conditions. There's this perception in many schools that the administration is not responsive to those concerns, and people are just afraid and upset. Again, remember the reason I showed you those data to start with is that's what people are experiencing baseline in terms of their worries and their vulnerabilities. What's making it even more difficult right now is that in many communities, there are 2 camps. It's like there are the people who remained and weathered the COVID experience in-house, wherever you are. And then there are the people who left. And it's created an incredible schism in many of the school communities. And people are unsure how to get back and reconnected, because those 2 groups of people experience each other with a great deal of sort of ill will and animosity right now. And it's something that we hadn't expected. And so again, school counselors are struggling to try to find ways to knit their colleagues back together, in addition to all of the difficulty that they're having with regard to the reintegration and getting back in. The other point that I think it's such a brilliant point this person made, Ed, and the other piece of this is that, you know, as a guy who grew up internationally and my mom was an international school teacher, okay, what was summer? I mean, summer was like the holy grail. I mean, that was when, I mean, where I grew up, you went on safari, or you went back to Europe or the States or South America or wherever you were from, you know, Central Europe, we're all, you know, everybody's from everywhere. But the idea is you went home, you saw your grandparents, you saw your aunts and uncles, your cousins, you saw your people. People met in awesome places like, hey, listen, I tell you what, we're going to meet you at Pisa and be there at noon on July 7th. We're all going to meet at the pizza place right under, you know, it's like, okay, none of that happened. Not only did people not take time off and they weren't able to move well, but they also worked through a lot of the summer because they were preparing for 3 different kinds of reintegration, either remote school, hybrid school, or in-person school. Which one? I don't know how much notice you guys all got, but my guess, I'm seeing a lot of people shaking their heads. I have a sneaking suspicion that you found out, like, you know, 36, 48 hours before you went to school, you know, what was going to be the story. So, I mean, those are essentially planning for 3 different schools. So people are exhausted. So you've got exhausted, emotionally wrung out people with very, very sort of, who are very prone for conflict right now, because there's this schism in many of these communities between the people who remained and the people who went out of the country and then returned. So it's a really, really difficult and challenging situation right now. And it is, and you guys have an extraordinary amount of work in this regard. We've been asked, I mean, this is, I hope not a shameless plug, we've been asked recently to help in some of this with organizational issues, because so many of the schools are really struggling in ways that are, I think, really disruptive. A buddy of mine was on the mountain rescue team. I was a ski bum for a while as a kid. And he told me about the first rule of mountain rescue, and I always remembered it. And the first rule of mountain rescue is, you don't fall in the crevasse too. Now I recognize, you know, I'm talking to people in Asia. So a crevasse up in the mountains where it's cold, there are these deep cracks that form that are made out of ice. And if you're not careful, you can ski and fall in them. And if you fall in them, you die. And so the mountain rescue team comes and they haul people out of these crevasses so they don't die. But the rule is, you're not supposed to fall in as well. The reason I say that is because you're dealing with lots of adversity. You're dealing with lots of people with an incredibly high demand and struggle emotionally. You've got to make sure that you safeguard yourselves. That's the second thing I'd like you to really write down and remember. If you don't remember my name and you don't remember anything else I told you, right? Distinguish between hurt and harm, and make sure you don't fall in the crevasse too, okay? And I'm going to talk about very briefly the 3 C's now. We're going to be doing some work at ISCA. The Truman Group is going to be bringing some folks over, and this is a very condensed version of what will be a series of talks. There's a whole bunch of us going to be there. Let me just talk first about collaboration. The first thing, the reason, I hope that's not a shameless plug. The reason I'm saying this is we're actually doing pieces on pretty much all of what I've got here: collaboration, consultation, and commiseration. Maybe not the commiseration so much. You should collaborate. Do not try to do all of this alone, because you can't. If you try to do this alone, you're going to burn yourself up and you're going to feel very, very bad in a very short period of time, and then you'll be useless. You need to collaborate with people in ways that are possible. It could be people who are trained. It could be people who are untrained. It gets us to the second point, which is consultation. Consultation is a formal process in our world, a formal process where you can officially get together in a regular way, where you count on people to talk about what's going on and what's difficult with regard to supporting kids, with managing and supporting faculty, dealing with your own personal and professional uncertainty about how to deal with what's going on right now. In our own practice at the Truman Group, all of our clinicians meet in regular consultation every week. That's how important it is for us. If you get isolated and you get burnt out, you're no good. You'll make mistakes and you'll make bad judgments and things go badly. And you shouldn't do that. If it's possible, hook up with somebody. The Truman Group is involved in developing consultation groups actually throughout the world. And some of you might even be in some of them. I don't know. But we've actually got, I think this year we're doing something like 20 of them. So it's probably between 80 and 100 schools around the world where members of counseling departments are coming in, and we've created some of these consultation groups. The reason I'm not shamelessly plugging them, we're not continuing to fill them. I'm just saying the reason we're spending our time doing this is because we're so sure and so committed to ensuring that people get both personal and professional support, that it really helps people. And so if you've got colleagues in the region, even if they're not at your school, we've got this technology, use it. Meet with them every week, meet with them every other week, right? Get a coffee, sit down before school, after school, find an hour, just meet and talk to each other about how are you dealing with, we've got kids who are struggling with, is your head of school completely out to lunch, and because let me tell you about what's going on with mine, right? I mean, you want people who understand the experience that you're having so that you can get help and you can get ideas and you can get support from your colleagues who you like and trust. And last, of course, there's nothing like commiserating with another person who really gets it. I saw a wonderful colleague this morning, and he and I both run practices like this. And I looked at him, I was like, how are you? He said, oh my God. He said, I'm just worn down. He said, he's a really tall guy. He said, I started out 6'5". He said, I feel like I'm about 5'2" right now. I said, well, you look about 5'2", my friend. I said, you don't look so. He said, you don't look so good either. I said, you know what's so bad? I said, I've got face recognition on my software. I wake up in the morning. This is true. I'm not lying to you about this. The other day, the face recognition didn't work. I think I was so kind of wiped out in the morning. It didn't even know who I was. It was very insulting. It's exhaustion. It's exhaustion. All right. So I guess what I would say finally about this is if you need help and you've got members of your community who require clinical care, you're really welcome to reach out to us. This email, inquiries@trumangroup.com, there's a real person who's responding to that. It's a way for us to manage housekeeping in terms of managing the intake process. If you've got somebody who you're concerned about, the best way to reach out to us is to introduce us by email to them. So if you just say, you've got Bob over here, you write an email and you say, hey, I'm writing to introduce Bob. You copy Bob on the email. And you say, hey, I talked to him. He said he was interested in potentially getting information about being cared for by somebody in your practice. And then we take it from there. We'll reach out to Bob. We'll say, hey, Bob, we understand it's not going easy on you. Are there ways that we might be able to help you? And then we could schedule an intake and look after them. Again, if you want to reach out to me, everybody is welcome to reach out to me directly. I'm really happy to have colleagues and talk to you about ways that if there's anything that I can do personally to help you at this point, I'm really glad to. And then our website is truman-group.com. So again, all this information is on the website if you want it. But I frequently get asked after one of these talks if we want somebody to be seen, what do we do? And the answer is, this is the most efficient and effective way of going forward. So thank you all. I mean, we've sort of gotten close to the witching hour here, but I'm glad to answer specific questions. If you want to turn on your mics, that seems fine. Or if it's easier because we all start talking over each other, you can write them in the chat, and Ed can type stuff if you want, or read stuff.
One of the things I'd like just to touch on, Sean, is that one of the topics that we began discussing with this is the development of small groups of counselors to become cohorts through the rest of the school year. Yeah. And the structure was that they would meet every 2 weeks, and the group would be limited to 5. They could be from the same school or not, and that each of those groups would be assigned a clinical psychologist member of the Truman Group. And that's one of the reasons that we're talking also to the heads of school, is to see if we can encourage them to help come up with funding to support their counselors. We're not looking for an enormous amount of money, but to go through a whole year and have a clinical psychologist devoted to your group, it won't be entirely free. So one of the reasons we actually had this meeting was to kind of share this idea with the counselors who were interested in participating tonight, to let you know that you're going to be hearing from us to see if you would be interested in forming a group. I mean, you can form a group by yourselves, and that's fine. You know, all the high school counselors in Ho Chi Minh City may want to form a group, but for the structure that has been piloted and worked elsewhere, to limit the group to 5 and to have a clinical psychologist advise the group on a bi-weekly basis seems to have been incredibly effective. And we'd like to, through EARCOS in partnership with Sean and his group, make this possible. So we're not going to get it all set up tonight, but I wanted to make sure that you understood that this was the beginning conversation and that we're looking for ways to bring some things forward. I know ISCA has also been doing some work in this area, and I had a nice talk with Cheryl Brown the other day about how we might be able to coordinate things together between EARCOS and ISCA more than has been done in the past. But this is a particular time with some real challenges, and if we can find a way to set structures up that will support the critical work that you're doing, then I'm all for it and want to find how we can support it in building these partnerships. Sean, other comments? I see you've got 7 comments. A lot of thank yous to you, Sean.
Oh, you're welcome. It's a pleasure doing this, really. I'm just looking here. Do you see, if anybody has a specific question and you wanted to switch on your microphone, it's probably, you just be brave and do it. That's fine. Anybody have any questions at all?
Sean?
Yes.
Sean, at my school, I'm a teacher as well as a counselor. So 50% of my time I devote to teaching. And schools, because of the excessive screen time, schools are asking teachers also to go asynchronous. But it kind of goes against what we know about engagement and, getting students with us. So how do you deal with this kind of, what is the best way to go?
Yeah, I'm sorry, that's too good a question. Could I get a worse question that's much easier to answer? Because I prefer one of those, if that's okay. No, I think it's a great question, and thank you for asking. I mean, I think, I agree. I mean, I think that ideally what we'd want to see is synchronous engagement with kids so that they have as much interaction as humanly possible, right? I think everybody sitting on the screen would agree. The problem is that in terms of both medical risk as well as country policy or school policy, to say nothing of, in many communities that we're connected to, there are still people who are locked in different spots. So there are schools who, I'll just pick India. India has schools that have started. They're working exclusively remotely at this stage.
Yeah,
but
we have one of those.
Yeah, they've got kids in, pick your spot. They've got kids in North America. I'll use North America because the time zones are so problematic, right? So the question then is, well, if you've got a 14-year-old kid, or worse, an 8-year-old kid who's 10 and a half hours away, time zone wise, from Delhi, what do you do in terms of synchrony, separate from like how quickly are the teachers going to burn out? And the answer is, we can't let the perfect get in the way of the good. I think that what's happening is the ship has got to sail now. We have to educate children as much as possible. We have to get kids back into the swing of things, whatever that means. And then I think what we want to do is, as quickly as possible, as aggressively as possible, engage kids in as much sort of interactive exposure as we possibly can. That's live.
Yeah,
I run a remote psychotherapy practice. I'm not against technology, but children are going to do better in classrooms, period.
No, as in we have a system where it is completely like they're all in India. Most, I mean, 95% of our kids are in India, and
Yeah.
they are in the same time zone. So time zone and all of that is not an issue. But
Yeah.
then the conflict is between screen time, and because otherwise they're continuously being spoken at with teachers in various classrooms, one after the other. And
Yeah.
then the thing is that, okay, go back, read something up, and then come back. So is there a system that works better, or a combination of both is the ideal? Because
I think it's probably a foot in each bucket, depending on developmentally where kids are as well. So for example, if you're talking about an IB history class, what those kids are able to do at 17, 18 is very, very different from, say, what, you know, an 8-year-old or certainly a 4-year-old is going to be able to do in terms of managing themselves in a classroom and getting adequate learning. So I think that there's a lot of variability with that. I think the other thing is that parents vary a great deal. You know, India, China, you know, just in terms of cultural sort of perspective, many of those families are more demanding and driving in terms of some of the academic stuff. And you know, that's just sort of culturally where people come from in terms of their perspective. I absolutely respect and understand that. The issue, though, is that when we have kids who are so removed from the other supports, it makes it very, very difficult for them to adequately, you know, make progress academically. I want the kids, the academics are huge. We want them to progress. But the problem is you have the emotional and social stuff, as I said, comes before the academics, because a kid who's decompensating emotionally will not be able to function adequately in an academic realm. It just is, it's disruptive. And it's not because I'm a soft psychologist. It's because it's like saying, if you drive a car and you don't put oil or gasoline in it, will it drive? And the answer is not very far.
thank you so much.
Yeah, any other questions at all? Either I was very good or very bad, one of the two. I think that, you know, we'll have to see.
Yeah, I was going to say, if not, then we thank you very much for giving up your Saturday morning, and I hope we'll see you again in further forums. But please do some thinking about how we can create cohorts and make this level of support available. We're really interested in trying to find a way to make it happen for people. It is a difficult time, and Sean, your comments about the temporary nature of this, you know, we have to remember that this is it's not going to be like this today forever. But for the time being, we've got to do everything we can and not let, as you say, not lose the good in our search for the perfect. So we have a wonderful community in EARCOS, and I think that there's a lot of resources that are available just in terms of the people in the region sharing their ideas. Really get some of these cohorts launched. And I'll be back in touch with an email about next steps. And please talk to your directors, your heads of school, about supporting this initiative, even though it's not completely fleshed out yet. We'd really like, we know that the heads are going to have to support it to give you some time and some resources, but you absolutely have to have it, I think. It's such an enormous challenge right now for everybody in the counseling world. So thank you. And Sean, wonderful. Any last closing comments?
Yeah, thank you all so much for taking a Saturday morning to do this. I mean, you're an astonishing group of people. I mean that honestly. I've traveled a lot and I work with school counselors a lot, and there is no group of people I would rather speak to than this group of people. It's Friday, as you know, it's Friday night here, and I have not even had a glass of wine yet. So you know, I can assure you that this is.
Some of them probably already have, even though it's Saturday morning.
So thank you all for coming. And it's a real offer. If there are ways that we can help you, please reach out to me. My clinical staff is available. We built this practice for all of you, for your communities, for our communities. I grew up in this community. These are our people. We have to look after them. And I so appreciate you doing all of this work. It's extraordinarily hard work. And I promise you, I'm going to.
We had a couple of questions.
Oh, sure. Let me just say this, and because it's an important promise. I'm going to speak to heads. Actually, Ed and I think, met at AAIE where all the heads gather. It was in New York where, you know, there's a big room full of them. And I talk about this stuff. I promise you, I'm going to say these things to the heads of schools. They can ignore me, but they do it at their peril, because these are things that have to be addressed in order for the kids to be supported properly. So you should know I'm advocating for these ideas in very, very, maybe not compelling, but certainly loud ways.
Compelling. Now, we've had a question about, will the slides be available for people to see?
Well, it's been recorded, right, Ed? So
well, we have actually made a recording. Now, the next step is for me to learn another thing is, how do I download the recording from the cloud so we can put it on the EARCOS website? Give me a couple of days.
Sure. And I mean, if people are desperate for it, I would say, you know, you're welcome to these. The slides, I wish that they were Nobel Prize worthy. I mean, you're welcome to them if you need it. But I would go with the recording first, and then if you need stuff, you know, you can always reach out to me.
So
Okay.
I asked the question, and it's just so I can maybe share some of the information with staff. So just not all of it, just so I can pull some of the statistics.
No. I'm really happy to have you do it, Regina. That's totally fine. This is not, hey, listen, we are all on the same page, on the same team on this stuff. But anything we can do to help with these conversations, to encourage people to be more responsive to this stuff, yes, use it. Quote me, use the statistics. The other thing is, a lot of the data that I quote, they're data that they're available publicly online. So if you go to CDC, to the CDC website, all of that, the original source stuff is there. And I probably should have created links for that. That would have been a good idea if I'd done it. If you email me, I can send you the links to some of that though. Happy to, because that gives you the original, like, Bible stuff. Yeah, the source code. Any other questions at all? You can be brave and turn on the mic. You can say stuff. All right. All right. Well, thank you all again. It's been such a pleasure being here with you. And my hope truly is that in a year or so that we're all able to meet in person, that be in a great big room. We'll be able to, you know, to talk to each other and as I said, go out and get some noodles on the street next time we're all together.
Great. All right, all of you, thank you for all you do. Stay safe, and you know, we'll do everything we can from our vantage point to help in any way that we can. So just let us know. Drop me a note if you have an idea about what we might be able to do to support your group or people in your schools. Okay? Otherwise, have a great weekend. Sean, thank you so much.
You're welcome, Ed. Bye, everybody.
Okay. Bye-bye.